In these historical times, where all kinds of crises meet each other, we see a great momentum to discuss issues, and also for us as an organization to do some thorough introspection. So in that sense, I see today also as an opportunity to listen and to learn. We are very, very lucky to do that with some amazing people. We will start the day talking about media power with journalist Ahmed Shihab-Eldin. I will get back to you more in detail on that in a minute. The second conversation, that will be at 3 o'clock Central European Time, will be about decolonizing design with the British graphic designer and writer Anushka Kandwala and Kenyan creative director Sunny Dolat. And we will wrap up the day with a session called Creating for Gender Equality. This session will be moderated by Dutch curator Saskia van Stijn, and she will be speaking with Mexican curator Jimena Acosta and Brazilian designer and activist Larissa Ribeiro. This session will specifically focus on the situation in Latin America. Okay, but first we start with the session Media Power. Who does the media serve? Big question. In the first session, we will hear from award-winning journalist Ahmed Shihab-Eldin about the importance of challenging bias and misrepresentation in the news. During this one-to-one conversation, we will explore what it means to be a media activist today, from addressing newsroom diversity to confronting racial stereotypes on screen. Drawing from his own experiences as a storyteller and as an Arab American, Ahmed will share some insights on how we can better navigate the world of information and influence. Ahmed, are you there?
Yes, Richard, I'm here. It's good to be with you.
Excellent. How are you doing?
I'm good. I can't complain. Everything is relative these days. I've been in Kuwait for about 100 days, which is unusual for me. The last time that happened was nice. In these uncertain times, I'm learning to, I guess, surrender to the uncertainty.
Yeah, because how did you get to Kuwait? Was it on for private things, or what was the reason to go to Kuwait?
It's a great question. I had just completed a few projects in New York, which is where I was living in Brooklyn. And in March, I started following the news, as one does when you're kind of a news junkie like myself. And something intuitively told me that not only would I be safer in Kuwait, but also my parents live here, and I was a little bit worried about them, leaving them alone. So I guess, I did what felt right at the time, and I think it was the right decision. But of course, now I'm kind of stuck. So just a reminder that there are consequences to all of our choices.
Absolutely, and because you told me that you have two nationalities, American, yeah. Kuwaitian. How do you say that in English?
Yeah, Kuwaiti, I guess. Essentially, yeah, I'm a Kuwaiti citizen, and I happen to be born in America, and I spent much of my life living in America as well as abroad. So, one foot in the West, one foot in the East, as you know, because you've heard me repeatedly say at various conferences that always feeling like an outsider, so always looking for a new perspective.
Okay. Hey, before we start the session, can you tell us a bit more about yourself? How did this thing get started? Because for our audience, probably some people already know you because you're a very well-known journalist. As I understand, you're also now nominated for a prestigious prize. Is that correct? So tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. It's always a exercise in what is relevant and what is a priority, because there's so much to say and also maybe not so much to say. In this moment, I guess I would define myself as a skeptical storyteller. Yeah. I've worked as a journalist for many different organizations covering social justice and human rights. I've been inside American news organizations, worked for international news organizations. And over the last few years, I guess you could say I've grown somewhat disillusioned with the sort of crisis of conviction that we find ourselves in. So yeah, I've always been someone who's been a bit, these days, Richard, to be very blunt about it, you asked me how I ended up in Kuwait. I'm learning a lot of new things in this moment that we're all living in. And I think a lot of it pertains to the media and to power and to privilege. And at the same time, I guess the biggest lesson that I'm learning, which also applies to what we're here to talk about today, which is media and power, is privilege. And I'm very painfully aware of my privilege. I don't mean it's a negative thing, but when you're confronted, as many of us are, with with these existential sort of questions that we're finding ourselves debating, you can kind of acknowledge your privilege or not. So I'm acknowledging that I'm actually, despite being from a marginalized group myself, or several marginalized groups in terms of identity, I also am relatively privileged. And I think that's an important thing to know.
Yeah. I think that's good that you say that. Of course, for me personally, that's also sometimes a weird thing to be aware of, but I'm so lucky that I live in the Netherlands, of course, for various reasons. But again, let's talk about the media and representation in the media. What do the terms misrepresentation and bias mean to you? For you as a journalist?
It's a broad topic, and that's why sometimes it can seem a bit abstract to discuss. But I think to kind of boil it down, for me, I've obviously endured a lot of misrepresentation in newsrooms, but also as a producer of news, but also as a consumer, seeing how different groups that I identify with, being Arab in America, being Muslim in America, the queer community in America, there's a lot of misrepresentation. And what does that mean? I think, in our day-to-day lives, we all know that misrepresentation comes in many forms. So there's underrepresentation, which is true in many newsrooms when it comes to these marginalized groups. There's exclusion. There's also discrimination. And also, as journalists and as storytellers, the words that we use to label groups of people or individuals, and of course, politicians as well. In America, Trump uses certain words that then the media perpetuates, for better or worse, to describe certain groups of people. So that all leads to implicit bias. And I think it's our job to break down the stereotypes and the misrepresentation within our own communities. And one of the only ways we can attempt to change the representation of others in media is to correct how we represent others. And I think a lot of this has to do with what we're seeing in this moment, right? Where there's an uprising in the US, but it really feels like on a lot of levels, there's an uprising against systems everywhere, and the institutions that many people see as failing to represent them properly. You see that in the US, you see that in Europe, on a micro collective level, and I think this all points to a lack of trust. And so when you mix bias in media, and even if there's a democratization or a decentralization of media that we've seen, that can also contribute to, as we've seen, misrepresentation, misinformation, because there's a lack of empathy in our efforts to resolve a lot of the fluidity of misinformation and kind of this flow of information that tends to fuel polarization and intolerance through a culture of confirmation bias. Richard, for better or worse, how many times have you or I gone online to search for information, whether consciously or not? We are hoping, if we were in an argument with someone or we're trying to make a certain point on social media, we're searching information that actually, it's funny, no one ever comes to visit, but I guess now that we're doing this, someone's here to visit. Information that actually, confirms our biases as consumers. And that makes it difficult for audiences to differentiate between different types of content. So I think it's the world is finding itself in a position where we're trying to identify new pathways to kind of better understand and resolve bias and misinformation. And I think, people are fed up with a lot of chronic and age-old misrepresentation, like the Black community in America, for example. And that's now, kind of taking a life of its own around the world, because people are fed up with feeling so misrepresented in a moment of despair and desperation that they're willing to risk their lives to make sure that those people in power, and often it's not just media power that exists on its own, but it works in symbiotic kind of relationship with political power. And so people are I think at their wits' end and ready to really demand proper representation.
Yeah. Hey, and when you look at your own practice, of course, also to illustrate this situation, can you give us a few examples on what did you bump into on a personal level as a journalist?
You know, there's big examples. Yeah, there's, I mean, you know, I entered journalism at a time when the media landscape itself was shifting dramatically into the digital space. And, you know, so even though I had tech skills, I had Arabic language skills, those things served me well in terms of getting jobs and also being taken seriously and being valuable within the industry at a time when, you may remember, just about 10 years ago or so, there were, you know, Arab uprisings, and it was a big story, these revolutions in the region. So that all served me. But on the flip side, when it comes to misrepresentation and bias, there was a lack of a willingness to even accept, let alone assign stories about, for example, the Arab world or Arab communities or Arab individuals or Muslims that didn't fit a specific lens that, you know, was about terrorism or violence or, you know, instability. And I think that's kind of a subtle way in which misrepresentation can have lasting consequences. You know, for me, for example, I was often judged based on my identity by employers and by people in the industry and dismissed to by virtue of the words or the ways I tell. But I never bought into the whole notion of objectivity because it felt very unnatural to me given my upbringing. You know, I didn't have a very attachment to a national identity, and I really refuted this idea, which I think is now starting to be deconstructed, which is a positive thing. This idea that to be a credible, trustworthy storyteller or journalist, you have to have no emotions. You have to not draw upon your own perspectives or perceptions or experiences, let alone, let alone to inject any sort of feelings into your reporting. And, you know, although in theory that sounds and has long been taught, I went to Columbia, I taught at Columbia, you know, it's a very prestigious journalistic university, and yet that's not realistic, you know, and languages we speak, the experiences we have, and specifically with the Black community, you know, as an Arab, like if I'm covering terrorism in America after 9/11 as an Arab, obviously I'm going to bring to it a different perspective and experience than, say, someone who's lived in Washington his whole life, who's white and who's never been to the Muslim world or what have you. Even if you do go to the Muslim world or to the Arab world to report on so-called terrorism, if you're not of that community, if you're not of that culture, you might not understand the nuances and also feel and be able to empathize inherently with the group of people that you're reporting on. So I know you asked me for like a personal take on this, but I think, you know, it's unfortunate because for as much as the internet and social media and the democratization of media has led to a multiplicity of voices and perspectives, information out there that even now trying to curate that information, it's very easy for information to, you know, in the US context, for example, right-wing information to kind of jump around the internet and gain credibility by simple exposure because of platforms and algorithms that reward, you know, likes and how many people view it, not whether it's true or whether it's, so you know, the world's kind of having a come to Jesus moment, for lack of a better expression. You know, we're living in a world where there are so many different sites that are profiting off of this human instinct, right? Of seeking narratives that validate our perceptions. And that worries me and makes me feel all the more skeptical as a journalist. So the crisis of conviction that's created this kind of digital dystopia that we're living in, you know, complete with the daily barrage of tweets from the president attacking members of, you know, part of the Congress in the US, attacking U.S. individuals, trickling from the top down, and it's also linked to this deep erosion in the trust in government, and it's interesting what it's conjuring up. I think we're in for a seismic shift of sorts in terms of who we deem credible and what kind of information we actually trust, if any.
Yeah. Hey, when I do one step back, you say that when you report, for example, in the United States about Arab issues or about terrorism, then you are aware of the fact that you are a so-called Arab American reporter. So then what goes on in your mind? How do you frame the issue to make it maybe more understandable, or that you how do you say that, are perceived as a trustworthy person? How does that work in your mind then?
It's a good question. I mean, you know, whenever you tell a story, you have to prioritize information and then you have to contextualize it. So it's a judgment call as to what contextual pieces of information are necessary for there to be understanding. And I think your question's actually quite essential because it gets to the real fundamental question, which is when you tell a story, what is the motivation and the intention behind telling that story? Are you hoping to amplify people's voices who are stifled, or, you know, what is the aim in telling that story? So for me, to use your example, if I'm covering the Arab American community in the US, or, you know, Muslim community, or even in the Arab world, I think it's inherently expected and very easy to understand how, just as if you were telling a story about Holland, you would choose to include certain things contextually that you know to be critical for there to be complete understanding and empathy for whatever story it is that you're telling. Oftentimes, what happens as a result of a lack of diversity, not just the news, Richard, like this comes down to the movie industry, and we've seen this play out for women, for Black people, for all kinds of minorities. When you're not in a decision making, you're in the news space, if you're not an editor, if you're not a journalist, then you often lack the context, again, that's needed, that perhaps can only, certain contexts can only be fully understood from a certain perspective from someone who is from within that community. Now, that doesn't mean that we can only cover our own communities and identities. And in fact, I've been doing a lot of work this past year on trying to detach from my attachment to my various identities, because that causes suffering. So that's my, like, you know, that's my self, that's my emotional healing work, right? Which is separate from what is needed in the media space. What is needed in the media space is proper representation, so that we do have this effect, for example, that we see in each time we see a Black person on TV who's linked to a violent crime or portrayed as a criminal, the neurons in our brain that link Blackness with criminality get triggered. And the same is true for other races, for Muslims, for Arabs. Every time on TV or in media or in the movies or on the show 20 Homeland or all these popular shows on Netflix where we only portray a certain group of people in a certain way time and time again, it limits our ability to be empathetic or to see them as human. And so that's why, again, to answer your question, so much of my work when covering any community is trying to draw upon my own experiences in order to provide a perspective that may be valuable simply because it is a perspective that is not held by the general historical perspective of people in power and privilege in America. And unfortunately, you know, it's 2020, and I have friends of mine, just anecdotally, who are women who work in producers, who are directors, who are writers. And you know how many times they call me so frustrated because they go to a meeting, they have a great script, and after the meeting, they hear things still in 2020 like, well, you know, if you're going to pitch it to the studios or if you want to get funding, they're not going to trust you with money, you know, so you might want to have a guy in the room, like you might want to have so-and-so in the room with you because, you know. And so that speaks to patriarchal privilege and power. It speaks to racial privilege and power and inequities. And, you know, I think there's an inability to empathize from people in power to those who are less powerful, and the same is true the opposite direction. And so we're starting to see this, I think, manifest in a lot of these protest movements happening around the world.
Yeah. Hey, and because in our call yesterday, or what is it, 2 days ago, you mentioned a few things, and so for example, you quoted the New Yorker, and sometimes a journalist should not tell all sides. Is that in fact what you just described? That because you have a certain context, you have a certain background, it's impossible to tell all sides, because from a more traditional point of view, a journalist, the news, the newspapers, the media should bring objective news. Or is it a very old school thought?
I think the question is, when we define this demand that journalists should have a view from nowhere or should be always objective, there's two questions. One, are we being true in suggesting that that is possible? Because bias and misrepresentation and misinformation are a product of not being aware or conscious of our bias as, said person trying to be objective. So for me, Richard, as I'm sure you may remember, transparency and accountability is really much more needed in terms of reestablishing trust, not just with the media, but with institutions. So if we can be how we relate to a story, go on CNN, there was one of their Black reporters who appeared on a program, and she was talking about how while all objectivity is important, and that was a term, because it's something we've become so accustomed to, this idea that journalists must be objective.
Exactly.
So much so that Fox News, used to say fair and balanced as part of their motto. But we all know that Fox News is not fair and balanced, right? It's blatantly obvious that they're neither fair or balanced. So the question becomes, she said, although we should aspire to objectivity and it's important, she acknowledged on live TV on CNN that the fact that she's a Black woman covering this moment in American history invariably gives her insights from an emotional place, but also an experiential place and an intellectual place that other reporters simply don't have. So the question becomes, is her perspective and her ability to be valuable even if it's not objective, or in fact, because she's not objective? And, the reporter kind of endorsed her position, this idea that yes, her perspective is so valuable in this moment precisely because of the insights that she has. And that's something that I knew to be true at a very young age, especially, going into journalism right after 9/11 in the US, the way I was treated, all my experiences, the way I was treated in newsrooms, it would be impossible for me to pretend that that wouldn't factor into my, particularly if I'm covering that marginalized community, as she, as a Black woman for CNN, is covering that community. So just to see that conversation, on CNN and have that kind of contradiction where she said objectivity is important, but my opinion but my storytelling in this situation is valuable because I'm not objective. So it's kind of like I think whenever we are forced to kind of let go of old models and old standards, it's always kind of disarming, and it can kind of make us disoriented and panicked and want to attach onto this. Objectivity served the privileged among us. And, if we continue to rely on objectivity, you start to have false equivalencies. You start to have this perception that there's two sides to a story. And to answer you, it's not that there's ever one side to a story, but if we look at the George Floyd example, a 9-minute video showing an officer kneeling on his neck that the whole world essentially saw. In covering that story, of course, in a court of law, everyone's entitled to a lawyer and, whatnot. But it's very difficult to watch that video and come away from it and, question whether that man was involved in his death or not. And so in this context, I think it's important not to simply aspire to be objective and in the process, undermine the purpose of why you're telling that story, which is to bring about change so that we don't, remain in this system of misrepresentation and inequality and injustice, which is what we're in when it comes to the Black community in the US.
Yeah. Tapping into what you just said, you also, when we had our conversations, you also said that the streets and the tweets are setting the tone. Right? I mean, this is, I think, a great and stunning example of that. But you also were wondering,
yes,
that's positive or negative? Is it problematic, or is it something we should support? I mean, the fact that the streets and the tweets are setting the tone. Are you happy with it, or is it a problem, or is it both?
Am I happy with what? Sorry, you cut out briefly.
Sorry. No, so the fact that as you mentioned, that the streets and the tweets are setting the tone, is that something good, or is it something problematic? Yeah. Because I think it also has two sides, as you just mentioned. The danger is on social media that you're always looking for the answers that you want to get.
100%. I think, to answer your question and to try to be succinct about it, President Trump, for example, was considering creating a White House panel that would kind of examine complaints of bias against conservatives on social media and what have you. And the reason I bring this up is that, we're seeing now social media organizations, Facebook, struggling to crack down on spam, fake accounts, fake news, and misrepresentation and misinformation. And, there was a time when I saw social media as, an exciting opportunity to decentralize by the voices of the most marginalized people among us. And there was power and potential in having access to tons of people, all over the world who are sharing their own stories, unfiltered. They're finding commonality. They're disrupting conventional methods of kind of the authoritative way that news and information used to be delivered, the sort of view from nowhere. And since then, what I think is worrying is, we've created these sort of, because of how polarized society is, and not just in the US, but, there's populist movements all around the world. And on the political level, you're starting to see the polarization on the ground replicated in the digital space. Yeah. So there's this digital dystopia where we all search for, we kind of hide behind these walled off identities, right? We're searching for information and we follow people who provide information and publish information and post information that confirms how we feel. So rather than the internet, which was supposed to be a global village, because of I guess I would say the way social media companies, let's be honest, are designed are to be addictive. And they don't really care much about what is being shared, so long as people are staying there, sharing it, living on the platforms. It's not like social media companies were made for altruistic purposes. They are companies that are making money. And in many ways, we are the products. We are not the users of these, because our information is being sold to advertisers, and then we're being sold products. And, and again, without getting too much into the capitalist system that we all live in, what worries me, to answer your question, is, what is going to happen when we are so polarized online, and it's so difficult to determine, and we're almost there, what is in fact true and what isn't, and the whether or not something is true carries less weight in terms of whether we believe it or not. And that's why I think the most important thing to do to challenge this in this moment is to not double down on the old way of doing things, which is to pretend. It's a very performative. Ask any journalist worth their salt about objectivity, and if they don't acknowledge the performative, aspirational aspect of it, then they're being they're not being transparent with you. Yeah. And so I think, again, we need to double down on transparency. And when you say that, when I made that comment about the streets and the tweets setting the tone, I think it's a good thing in the sense that you're starting to see shifts happening, for example, in the US when it comes to the Black community, that would have never happened the same way that the Me Too movement triggered accountability in the context of women and inequality and sexual abuse. And why for 50 years, it's not as if all of a sudden this was happening more than history. So what triggered those social movements which led to a policy shift, whether it's Me Too or Black Lives Matter? It's the fact that the streets and the tweets are impossible to just simply ignore. The question then becomes, what is the motivation behind posting these things online, and how can we see each other and shift our perspectives beyond that? I think, you know, if I had the answers, I wouldn't be here talking to you. If I had all the answers, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I'd be building that new platform. But it's encouraging to see that people are able to advocate for themselves, who have, you know, been disqualified or excluded from having a voice, and having a voice in terms of how, you know, they're policed, how they have access to healthcare. And for the sad truth is, many people only have a voice online.
Yeah, no, absolutely true, absolutely. Hey, because I forgot to mention that, but people, our audience can also send questions to Ahmed. You can do that via Facebook, or you can send Instagram, via Instagram a message, then we will read it and I will bring it up. I do have, by the way, a question from Natasha on Facebook. How has social media changed your relationship with mainstream media? In a way, I think you already told us a bit about it, but has it changed your ideas of credibility?
Yeah, I think be redundant or too repetitive. I appreciate the question, because a lot of us see social media, the way the question is framed, as separate from the traditional and mainstream media. But the reality is, what we're seeing is that mainstream media organizations also are, you know, very heavily involved in social media. And the reason that happened, and I appreciate the question, because I actually witnessed this in my career. I witnessed this shift over a 5-10 year period. The mere 24-hour news cycle and the rapid pace with which social media proliferated 10 years ago meant that news organizations that were more traditional and mainstream had to cover certain topics that were otherwise long being neglected and ignored. And I can give you trillions of examples. And so as a result, even though there's a positive aspect to that, which means that mainstream organizations now have to broaden the kinds of stories they tell about all kinds of different communities, on the flip side, it means that because there's this push to publish quick and fast, not only do facts and verification sometimes fall by the wayside, but it's very difficult to determine, in this plethora of information constantly being published by individuals, by blogs, by bloggers, by mainstream organizations. It's very difficult to not only know what to consume, but what to trust. And, you know, I think it's, again, it's not an either or. I think we're seeing social media companies or digital first companies learning from traditional ones, and vice versa.
Okay. Hey, maybe this is also.
But if we're going to be forward looking, Richard, very briefly, go ahead.
No, I was thinking it might be a nice bridge to some images that you would like to show. Shall we go and check that out? I mean, we also, of course, have as I always say, sort of a design-driven audience, and I think you also had some interesting visuals that you'd like to discuss with us. Shall we do that?
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. I'm trying to share my screen now. I hope it's working. Can you see this?
Well, I think it's. Is
it working?
Yes, there we are.
Richard, can you see my screen, or you can't hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Loading.
Yeah, there we are.
So very, very briefly, this is just an example of something that I wanted to share that kind of illustrates how social media can be powerful in shifting perspective around a story that has long been misrepresented. In this case, two stories. One, police brutality in America. You can see the image of the man who is kneeling on George Floyd, or a black man on the right, wearing the US police uniform. And then on the left, an Israeli soldier kneeling on a Palestinian. Now, the reason I wanted to just briefly discuss this, and maybe this might be the most important one to discuss, is because, you know, these two communities are very different, the Black community in America and the Palestinians in Israel. And yet they suffer, and there is something that they share in common, not just in terms of being dehumanized or being, you know, oppressed, explicitly or subtly, or however you want to view that oppression. But the symbolism of this image, and the reason I chose to share it, and with a caption same but different, is it speaks to something that is very critical, that is lacking in able to progress as society. And that is, you know, there's a lot of, for example, how can I put this? There's a lot of common struggle between these two oppressed groups, but there isn't a lot of context in terms of how those narratives and those experiences are discussed in the media. For example, in the many, you know, talk about police brutality in America without acknowledging that the mental and the system of policing in America was actually founded to continue to oppress a certain group of people many years ago. And it's just now we're evolving over time, right, to try and limit that. What you're seeing is, you know, there are, I think, 22 states or more in America that the police forces receive training in Israel by paramilitary groups, by the military. And this is done with taxpayer money. Now, anyone watching this, Richard, I'm very well aware, will be like, oh, look at this Palestinian journalist originally who is, you know, making this thing political, and he's, you know, but again, that's a perception based on my identity. But what I'm trying to say is, why is it when we talk about police violence in America, do we never acknowledge in the mainstream, for example, except on social media, is it acknowledged that a lot of the brutality that we're seeing on the streets of America that is affecting Black people and that is, you know, robbing them of their lives and their dignity, a lot of that training comes from this very close relationship where, you know, US officers go and learn in Israel from the military. And so that is just one example how, you know, if we want to tackle bias and misrepresentation, you know, we have to take into account facts that perhaps are often swept under the rug. And I think this image is very powerful. And again, we talk about social media as a motive, and that's both a positive thing, but it's dangerous. There are no facts in this image. But of course, in the caption, I explain later why, you know, this is important. And again, like, this is just another example. In Norway and Finland, in the US and Germany, this is another thing I posted recently that explains what is required, what is the actual path towards becoming a police officer. There is something that America suffers from, Richard, that is called American exceptionalism. It is often celebrated culturally in America, that we are somehow exceptional to the rest of the world. And, you know, I think what we're starting to see as a result of the coronavirus pandemic is how big a fallacy that is. And it's been a humbling moment, to put lightly, for a lot of Americans. Need ultimately 21 weeks of training to become a police officer. So where is the accountability? Where is the experience? And so this is an important example of how context and contextual comparison have a better understanding of a problem, say police. And I think these are the sorts of things, whether in written form or in video form or even in meme form, these are all facts that I'm providing. This is not an article that I wrote, but as a journalist, it's important for me to provide this, to provide context, to better further understanding and empathy with certain communities, in this case, the Black community in the US. Here's just another quick example. You know, we hear this term because of how polarized, again, I was speaking about how polarized the world is, but also in the digital space, we're also polarized, and that's replicated there. Tanya McDowell lied about the school district she lived in so her 6-year-old could go to a better school, even though she was homeless. She was sentenced to 5 years in jail. Felicity Huffman, someone we all know, for those of us who've watched Desperate Housewives, you know, she paid $15,000 to an SAT administrator to cheat on her daughter's test so she could get her into a better college. she was sentenced to 14 days in jail. So again, this kind of content, and I just put the slogan, all lives matter. So I'm not saying much. I'm not writing who, what, where, when, why. And many people might see this as activism. They might not see this as valuable storytelling. But to me, this image on my Instagram, to my 75,000 followers or 80,000 followers, it's impactful in generating understanding and in helping people reflect, and in also dispelling this misrepresentative and misleading term of all lives matter. And a lot of my friends, even my friends who are not, white or, not privileged, they say, yeah, but all lives do matter. And of course, all lives matter. But, it's important, people here, this is another example, like in Kuwait, there's a lot of people here, Richard, who advocate for Black lives online, on social media. They post a black square. And, obviously there's something that happens, Richard, online where we're very performative, whether we're conscious or not. Let me see if I can just to share, whether we're conscious or not, of our, this speaks to a hypocrisy. Yeah, go ahead. I'm too much.
Because I unfortunately, we have to wrap up in a few minutes. So
okay, fair enough.
I also see another question coming up, and maybe that's also a good question to sort of wrap up with, because of course we are also having these conversations now. Okay, what will the future bring? How can we change? So here's a question. We've talked a lot about what it means to be a responsible journalist, but what can we as readers do very concretely to become more responsible consumers of news? I think that's a super interesting question. So in that sense, not you, but the people you communicate with, the reader, the consumer.
What can we as readers do? Sorry, forgive me, Richard. What, if you were to put it briefly, because you cut out for a second, what can news consumers do?
Yeah, we talk about responsible journalism.
Oh, it seems like
what can we as readers do?
I think I may have lost you briefly.
Are you still there? Do you have me back? Can you hear me?
Interesting. I think Hi, Richard. I think I lost you. I don't know if you want to.
Now I can hear you.
Fantastic.
Can you hear me as well?
Yes, now I can.
It's modern technology. Hey, we have to wrap it up because we have 1 minute left. But
what
is there a message
in 30 seconds
to the audience? How can we pick this up?
I think the best advice I can give you is to try to counter this instinct we have to seek that which confirms what we already believe. And in order to do that, it's to follow maybe people or to search for individuals who don't reflect your implicit biases. And it sounds like easy enough, but it's a hard thing to do because it's against our human nature. But it's critical in developing some awareness and space so that we can eventually empathize with those who have very different experiences to us. Because without that, this is all a futile conversation.
Okay, Ahmed, thank you so much for this conversation. For me, it has been very enlightening, and I hope also for our audience. Again, you are a very well-respected journalist, but also a very well-respected, what Dezeen can do, alumnus. We met for the first time, I think, in Toronto. You came to Amsterdam and Mexico City. And I hope to see you very soon again. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
As do I. Take care of yourself. Take good care.
Thanks.